Really looking forward to hearing your scene setting for Budget 2022 in just over 2 weeks' time. Also, a very warm welcome to the Netherlands Ambassador to New Zealand, Her Excellency Mira Walberg. Great to have you here, Mira, and also with Marcia joining us from the Embassy. So fantastic to see you both. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us. Now, I've noticed not too many people have had some breakfast yet, but on the way out, please feel free to take the breakfast. We're supporting a fabulous group called Eat My Lunch, which donates one free lunch to kids in need for every meal that we purchase. So please, for those that want to take a box of breakfast with you, take one with you, please. Hey, a couple of health and safety instructions. In the event of a fire, please take the stairs, which was just opposite where we came in, down to ground level and meet out at Lambton Quay. And in the event of an earthquake, heaven forbid, please move away from the windows, take cover and hold, and wait until the shaking stop. And again, we'll go down the stairs. Please keep away from the lifts. Now, just look a little bit about Rabobank before I hand over to the Minister. We are proudly New Zealand's only specialist food and agri bank. We were set up in the Netherlands over 120 years ago as a cooperative by farmers for farmers, and today we operate in 38 countries and are amongst the world's 30 largest financial institutions. Here in New Zealand, we have a single focus on supporting Kiwi farmers, growers and food producers. Our 500 employees work from 28 offices in places like Ashburton, Pukekohe, Fielding, and from our new purpose-built head office in Hamilton, which opened late last year. Under our global mission of growing a better world together, Rabobank takes a long-term view of food and agri. We work alongside our rural clients, supporting them to achieve their business goals and to deliver on issues such as sustainability, climate change, water regulations and so on. Minister, you'll be pleased to know that ever since Rabobank's been in New Zealand, which is about 25 years, every dollar of profit has stayed here and helped us to continue to support and grow in the local market. Our employees are deeply committed to communities where they live and work through volunteer days, community projects and sponsorships. And I do just want to call out 3 examples. 2 years ago, Rabobank partnered with food rescue charity Kiwi Harvest. Kiwi Harvest rescues up to 200,000 kilos of perfectly good food every month that would otherwise end up in landfills and delivers it to families and communities. And it's great to have Kiwi Harvest CEO Gavin Finlay with us here today. Great to see you, Gavin. Secondly, backed by our client councils, we're a supporter of Surfing for Farmers, which assists the mental wellbeing of farmers by getting them off farm and into the surf through the summer months, and it's really been a positive and really popular program again this year. And the third example I just want to talk to is our sponsorship of the Agribusiness in Schools program. There are now over 3,000 secondary school students at more than 100 schools around the country supporting studying agribusiness, encouraging and preparing them for possible careers in the sector. And so hopefully by that you see that we're really strongly connected to our communities. And overall, Rabobank's strategy is to become New Zealand's leading food and agri bank. And we'll do that being backed by a global team of research analysts. We have access to the latest in-depth insights into food and agri market trends and opportunities. And more broadly, we're committed to working with policymakers to provide input to key issues through the eyes of our clients. In the past few years, we've made policy submissions on issues ranging from farm debt mediation, the Zero Carbon Bill, freshwater regulations, the Climate Change Commission's interim advice, and just a few weeks ago on the exotic forestry framework within the emissions trading scheme. Ladies and gentlemen, through the COVID pandemic, the food and agri sector once again demonstrated its huge contribution to the New Zealand economy and to the well-being of regional communities right up and down our country. And long may that continue. Rabobank is committed to ensuring that the opportunities and challenges facing the sector are discussed openly and constructively. And Minister, hosting you here this morning, I hope is a demonstration of that commitment. So I'm really looking forward to hearing about some of the government's priorities in Budget 2022. And Minister, if I can just say, if the ink's not dry yet on the budget, It would be great to see a little bit extra support for research and innovation in the primary sector, especially in technology around reducing greenhouse gases emissions. So it's just an idea. Give it some thought. So
Maybe a little earlier next time.
So with that, I'll just hand over to the Minister and look forward to it. Thank you.
Kia ora, ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Atamarie, good morning. Thanks, Todd. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks very much to Rabobank for hosting us today. Can I also acknowledge the Netherlands Ambassador as well, and also my parliamentary colleague, Kieran McAnulty, who's popped over the hill from the Wairarapa this morning. He knew there was a free breakfast. You'll find him everywhere in Wellington for that. And thanks to all of you for coming along today. It's an early start, and I recognise that. Yesterday, New Zealand opened its borders again to tourists and business visitors from around 60 visa waiver countries as we continue our reconnection with the world. The resumption of tourism and recent trade missions led by the Prime Minister to Singapore and Japan show that New Zealand is open for business. We are in a strong position to plan for New Zealand's future in a post-COVID world. I want that future to be one where we provide economic security to all New Zealanders, while delivering higher wage jobs that support a low emissions economy. Today, I want to outline how Budget 2022 will contribute to that goal, and in particular, how we are going to rebuild and maintain a strong fiscal position while tackling the major challenges that face our economy and society. The context in which we are doing this was unimaginable just 2 years ago. COVID has changed everything. And while we have come through strongly, alongside the success, there have been significant costs for many businesses, sectors of our economy, and on individuals, particularly when it comes to mental health. This is not unique to New Zealand, of course. The effects of the pandemic, the anxiety and uncertainty, are something that the World Health Organization has recognised as being a global phenomenon. I want to acknowledge, particularly given Rabobank's role and the representation in this room, the work and dedication of our farmers and growers who have kept the exports moving and the income arriving during the pandemic. The merchandise trade figures that were out last week show just how strongly goods exports have grown during the pandemic. In the year to March 2022, our goods exports were up by more than 8% compared to March 2020. In the past year alone, both milk powder and meat exports are up by more than 15%. The partnerships created between business and government to help make this happen were invaluable, particularly the air connectivity scheme that we funded to keep exports flying in and out as global air freight was about to dry up during worldwide lockdowns. But if the pressures of a global pandemic weren't enough, the world is now faced with a global inflation spike as a result of the ongoing supply chain disruptions and the war in Ukraine. Recently, the US recorded inflation of 8.5%, Canada 6.7%, Germany 7.3%. I've left the Netherlands out, Ambassador. UK 6.2%, with recent forecasts that it will grow towards 8%. The very latest OECD average for inflation was 7.7% in March, putting New Zealand about the middle of the pack. Now, even if the inflation spike is expected to be temporary, this does not take away the significant impact it is having on households and businesses. That's why we've moved quickly to cut fuel excise and halve the price of public transport to support New Zealanders who are feeling pain at the pump. This is on top of changes to increase income support for low and middle income families from the 1st of April, and then from Sunday just gone, the resumption of the winter energy payment to help those on income support and our superannuitants to meet the costs of heating their homes this winter. This is all part of our plan to move away from broad-based economic support, which was needed during COVID, and towards more targeted support to help manage our costs and avoid exacerbating inflation. We're also focused on addressing the constraints and forces that are fueling inflation, including through our immigration rebalance, supermarket competition reform, and reducing our reliance on volatile commodities like oil. In the face of the challenges that we have, it is comforting to know that New Zealand has done well during COVID-19 compared to the rest of the world. Our economy has come through the COVID shock better than almost anywhere else. We have received 2 AAA credit ratings from the 2 leading agencies, something few countries in the world are able to say. GDP is up 5.6% from a year ago, and our economic activity is higher than it was before COVID-19. Unemployment is at a record low of 3.2%, against expectations when COVID hit that it could rise as high as 10%. Wages have outpaced inflation up until this recent spike and are forecast to do so again for every year after 2022, meaning households are better off. Our debt is set to peak at about half of Australia's, around a third of that in the UK, and around a fifth of the US, measured consistently as a percentage of GDP. None of this has happened by accident. It happened because we realised in New Zealand that a strong health response to COVID-19 was also the best economic response. It happened because we were prepared to step in with more than $20 billion of direct support for businesses and workers through the wage subsidy and resurgent support schemes. Our calculated and considered economic policies during COVID have worked for New Zealand and New Zealanders. And we are now in a strong position as we look at what investment is required to grow the economy further as we plan for what the new normal looks like in a world where COVID is under control and as inflation rates return back down towards more normal levels. I'm not underestimating what a challenging period of time we are in for the New Zealand or global economy. But our success means being able to provide economic security in a volatile world and close the infrastructure gap as we plan for the future. And that's where Budget 2022 represents a key marker in our response to and recovery from COVID-19. Today, I will outline our fiscal policy approach for the budget, and in a speech next week, I will talk further about how the budget will promote our economic security and overall well-being, so you get the technical speech, sorry. I mentioned a moment ago our comparatively strong debt position. This chart is the IMF's most recent net debt forecast in a measurement which is consistent across countries. These are their very latest forecasts released during April, and so it incorporates all of the IMF's analysis of COVID spending and investments announced to date around the world. You can see the strength of our position. Our net debt is forecast using the IMF measure to peak at just over 21% of GDP next year and then fall over coming years down to 16%. I'm using the IMF's comparisons because it provides a more consistent framework for making cross-country comparisons. New Zealand has actually been an outlier in international circles in terms of how we measure our net debt. Compared to this slide, our main net debt measure reads at 35.2% of GDP in the latest Crown accounts to the end of February, with the half-yearly update forecasting it to peak at 40.1%. I can announce today, he said, hoping it's there, yep. I can announce today that we have accepted the Treasury recommendation that New Zealand starts using a new headline debt measure that is more comprehensive and will move New Zealand much closer to the international norm to help compare our fiscal sustainability against others around the world. The measure will better reflect the sustainability of our government's finances. This means it will include a wider range of our assets, in particular the New Zealand Super Fund, but also our liabilities, including debt held by other Crown entities, such as Kāinga Ora or Waka Kotahi, that have previously not been covered by the core net debt figure. The new measure gives us a net debt figure about 20 percentage points lower than the current one. The budget documentation will continue to publish the old measure for transparency and the ability to make historical comparisons. This will be the fourth budget that we have put together using the wellbeing approach. Essentially, this recognises that there are many aspects to what makes for a successful economy and society. We need strong finances and sustainable growth as much as we need healthy and educated people, clean air to breathe and water to drink, and strong communities where we look after each other. Our economic security and future are determined as much by our health and mental health, the skills and education and the people that people have, and the housing that we live in. To get to that position, we need to do things differently as a government. We need to break down the silos between departments. We need to look further ahead to how our directions affect future generations and to make sure that we address the big, complex challenges that lie ahead. Over my time as Minister of Finance, I've been aware that the way we put a budget together can have a huge influence over whether we're moving towards our goals. One of the early changes we made was to move from an annual capital allowance to a multi-year capital allowance. When I became Minister, annual allowances meant that a large capital purchase could wipe out much of the allowance in a given year. And as public accounting rules require the full cost to be booked when a decision is made, rather than when the expenditure actually occurs. By moving to a rolling 4-year allowance, we've given ourselves much needed room to better plan our investments and give certainty to those that we work with to deliver them. In Budget 2022, we will be making further changes to modernise our budget processes to support a long-term, more joined-up approach that is essential to delivering improved wellbeing. I've already indicated that there will be 2 major areas of focus for new spending in the budget: health and climate change. In both cases, we will be moving to multi-year funding allocations to better control costs by allowing for long-term planning. Our reforms of the health system are designed to end the unfair postcode lottery and inequities of the DHB model that I know have been felt acutely in rural areas. The current health system is incredibly inefficient. Over the past 2 decades, DHBs have learned to run annual deficit after annual deficit because they know the annual budget process allows them to do that. We're putting an end to that. Budget 2022 introduces initially a 2-year funding allocation as we get our new streamlined health system up and running. Once that's fully in place, health will be placed on a 3-year budget so that they can plan for what services New Zealand will need and then put their heads down to get on with the job of delivering services instead of delivering deficits. We're also making an important update to our budget process to ensure we have the ability to make the significant investments we need to tackle the complex, multi-generational issue of climate change. That's why we have set up a dedicated funding stream for our climate change investments by recycling the proceeds from the emissions trading scheme directly into a climate emergency response fund. It will operate as a 4-year rolling fund that will allow us to kick off the major programs required to meet the emissions budget set by the Climate Commission and to invest in important technology and innovation, Todd. This works very much like the National Land Transport Fund works to fund our transport projects, where fuel excise and road user charges are protected to be only used for investment in transport. It will provide the confidence that we can plan ahead with certainty, and it means our climate investments don't add to debt. The other change we're making in terms of the structure of the budget is the piloting of long-term funding for 2 clusters of departments, in this case in the Justice and Natural Resources area. We've undertaken an expenditure review for the departments covered by each cluster. The funding that has been allocated is connected to key goals jointly set by the groups of ministers and departments that will receive the funding. Not only is this breaking down silos, but the clusters are funded for 3 years, meaning that they do not have to come back for funding for programs each year. Departments and agencies have the certainty of funding so they can plan ahead, lock in longer-term contracts to have greater certainty on costs, hire the experts they need, and put in place plans to be able to manage cost fluctuations. Now, I apologise if all of this is a little bit pointy-headed, but it's important. We have to plan better if we're going to deliver better outcomes. We need to give more certainty and direction if we're going to meet the challenges ahead and maintain fiscal discipline. These public finance reforms are critical to underpinning our future success as a country. The other significant shift that you'll see in Budget 2022 is the return of fiscal rules to guide our budget. Many of you will remember that when Labor came to office in 2017, we committed to a set of fiscal rules called the Budget Responsibility Rules. They included running overgale surpluses while reducing debt to below 20% of GDP. On the debt side, we achieved that in our first budget and indeed in our second, and we ran 2 surpluses in the 2 years before COVID hit. Then COVID obviously changed all of that. Just as the previous national government ran deficits and increased net debt following the GFC and the Canterbury earthquakes, we have done the same to protect New Zealanders from the effects of COVID-19. Throw in the impact of the war in Ukraine and the ongoing supply chain disruption as a result of COVID-19, and we are faced with running 5 years of deficits compared to National's 6. The first surplus since the 2018-19 year is expected in 24-25. The keen-eyed among you will realise that this is a year later than we set out in December. We are not alone in toning down some of our expectations as a result of the war and ongoing supply chain issues. The IMF has said global growth will average 3.5% over 2022, down from the 4.4% it had previously forecast in January. All that said, achieving a surplus within the next 3 fiscal years at a quicker rate than National did after the GFC is something that I'm proud to be able to do as Minister of Finance. It's important that we return to surplus in a measured and balanced way that supports New Zealanders through COVID and its ongoing impacts. But it's also important that we do return to surplus because that gives us the best ability to address that key challenge of closing New Zealand's infrastructure gap. The path for returning to surplus also puts downward pressure on inflation. Over the past few months, I have been working with the Treasury to chart a course for a more sustainable and secure fiscal position. In its advice to me, the Treasury focused on being able to achieve 3 objectives. Firstly, over time, being able to finance current spending from current revenues. Secondly, being able to borrow finance for high-quality intergenerational capital investments. And thirdly, retaining the capacity to borrow to support economic stability in the event of large economic shocks by ensuring that our debt levels remain prudent. The new fiscal rules will ensure we're controlling spending, keeping a lid on debt, and are able to make those important investments in infrastructure. The first new fiscal rule that I'm announcing today is a commitment that once we reach our Obergau surplus as planned in 2024-25, we will maintain that within a low range of 0% of GDP to 2% of GDP over time. The range is based on advice from the Treasury and is the same as the forecast ahead of the 2017 election under the previous government's spending plans for the coming years. The surplus rule will also be the primary rule that controls our spending decisions and requiring value for money. The surplus means current spending is paid for from current revenues. It means the current generation is paying for its own consumption, taking pressure off inflation and putting the country in a better position to invest in infrastructure for future generations. It means day-to-day government spending is not adding to the debt that we have as a country. It allows us to control and reduce debt, with Treasury's analysis showing that the position of the surplus or deficit is the main driver of changes in net debt. It's equally important that we don't run surpluses too large in such a way as to undermine the necessary investments that we make to run essential public services. The surplus rule will give us the flexibility to dip temporarily into a technical deficit from time to time for very specific reasons. This includes when we have to book upfront expenses at the start of an infrastructure project, or where a major government program is required, or to fund major infrastructure projects that will be delivered by entities other than central government. The surplus target will be measured over time as opposed to year on year. Again, this is a sensible approach that means a surprising fiscal shock in 1 year, like a major asset revaluation or if a major trading partner experiences a short recession, doesn't crowd out other government spending on areas like health, particularly if the shock is going to reverse out again. For the purposes of the Public Finance Act, the government has to set its long-term objectives for 10 years. So, in the budget documents, the surplus target will be measured over this time period, with annual reporting each year continuing. That brings me to the second fiscal rule that I'm announcing today. Based on advice from Treasury, we will introduce a net debt ceiling for the government that will ensure New Zealand maintains some of the lowest government debt in the world, while having room to respond to the types of shocks we typically experience every decade, and being able to make the vital infrastructure investments that are needed to support our economy. Using the old measure of net debt, the Treasury has recommended the ceiling be 50% of GDP. When we translate that to the new measure, that cap is 30% of GDP. The Treasury considers that this is a prudent level of debt, particularly when combined with the Obergau surplus rule. In developing advice, the Treasury has followed an approach set out by the International Monetary Fund on sustainable debt levels. This includes an estimate of what would be a sustainable limit or peak in the event of a 1 in 100 year shock that would see debt spike significantly higher than the ceiling. For the purposes of our fiscal rules, we are comfortable that a ceiling of 30% or 50% on the old measure takes this into account and gets the balance of discipline and room to invest right. So where would a 30% ceiling place us in the world if it were fully used? I want to take you back this time to the graphical version of the IMF chart I showed earlier. The 30% ceiling is one that is internationally comparable because it means our debt is measured in a similar way to the likes of Australia. The IMF forecasts show we are setting our ceiling at a lower level than debt readings that Australia is expected to produce, and our actual net debt position will be about half of Australia's. It's important to note the debt ceiling is not a target, and we are tracking well and truly under it. In light of current inflationary pressures and capacity constraints, we will not be increasing the planned multi-year capital allowance for budget 2022. This will give us time to ensure that in future budgets we are making investments in the most effective and efficient way possible and in line with the infrastructure strategy that was released yesterday. This does mark a shift in position for the Treasury to recommend such a change. They have noted that in their advice to me that a low point level target which has been set at a below fiscally sustainable level has happened in our past. These targets can lead to decisions to not fund critical infrastructure in a timely manner, and it's timely to move away from that. As the Infrastructure Commission made clear in its strategy released yesterday, New Zealand has a gaping infrastructure deficit. One estimate fed into that report is that New Zealand is sitting on an infrastructure deficit of $104 billion. Every one of us knows what that looks and feels like in real life. It's the hours of productivity lost stuck in Auckland's traffic. It's the burst water pipes here in the capital. It's the rundown hospitals in the provinces. For decades as a country, we have failed to make the investments that we need to drive productivity and improve well-being. New Zealand's population grew from 3 million to 4 million across 30 years from 1973 until 2003. We then grew from 4 million to 5 million in just on half of that time. But we didn't build the houses or the public transport networks or the public services needed to match up with that population growth. I'm not prepared for our country to be on the back foot any longer when it comes to infrastructure. Our investments using the fiscal headroom created by this fiscal rule will need to be high quality, well thought through, and have a clear and direct benefit to our productivity and well-being. There is a critical balance here for us to grasp. We can keep a lid on debt while finally making progress on our infrastructure challenges. In conclusion, there's no doubt that COVID has been tough the world over, and there will be difficult times for many New Zealanders for a while as we continue to respond to the global pandemic and deal with the rising cost of living. But New Zealanders have worked hard and put us in a strong position to be able to deal with that. And I'm excited about the opportunities New Zealand has created for itself off the back of our world-leading COVID response. It is now time to move back to a position where we have clear fiscal rules. As a person who came to my political consciousness in the 1980s, I know the damage that can be done when we lose the balance of our fiscal position. The impact falls most heavily on those who can least afford it. Equally, knee-jerk reactions, short-term responses can mean that we fail to invest in what our country needs for the future. Our fiscal approach means we can plan for the future. We can rip off the Band-Aid approach to infrastructure and invest properly to future-proof for future generations. We can help them battle climate change, help them be more productive, make it quicker and safer to move around our country and get our goods to market. This will be a pivotal change as we move towards a high-wage, low-emissions economy that provides economic security in good times and in bad. Thank you for listening today, and I'm very happy to take your questions. Kia ora koutou. The media get lots of questions at the end, so this is your chance.
Minister, can you just unpack the natural resources cluster
Yeah.
a little bit more? And the second one would be ETS recycling. What's the value of that?
Sure. On the latter point, we signalled at the end of last year, it's about $4.5 billion that we've been looking at as a package, but that's a 4-year rolling fund, and so it will obviously get added to. I think the basis was the $75 a tonne. I think when we set it happened to be the rate when we did set it. There's a little bit of volatility there, but we can plan ahead over the cycle. So about $4.5 billion in the fund as we kick it off. On the clusters, thank you for asking too. Natural resources includes environment, primary industries, conservation, missed somebody else in there too. But that area where we're looking at what we can do in some aspects of energy and resources. We're looking there at what we can do to get a clear set of guidelines. It is separate from that climate fund, so those agencies will be obviously working on issues within the climate response, but it does go to many of the things that I know people in this room work on with the sector, around how we do farm management plans, how we support people in that kind of space, some of the research and innovation issues that Todd raised earlier. But the point of these clusters is to actually get agencies to have a common set of goals. And we often say it, people don't wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to use the services of MPI, followed by the services of MFE, followed by the services of DOC. People wake up and think, what am I doing and how can I work with the government as a whole to do that? And so that exercise of setting those goals for the sector, which we'll publish at the budget, has been really significant. The other aspect is, which not all of the ministers and departments totally appreciated, was that we did do an expenditure review across those clusters to say, well, where is your current spending? But the really important element of those clusters is the ability to say, here's 3 years of funding. And this is the whole thing about the annualised budget process, which while it's got some benefits in terms of constantly checking and rechecking what you're doing, it does make it harder to plan. It does make it harder to do long-term contracts. It arguably makes it more expensive for government because we can't do some of that long-term contracting that we should. These are pilots, that's the other thing that I should say. So we've done one in justice, one in natural resources. We'll take a breath after the budget to look at how that might roll out further in the future. But the kind of changes that we've made with the multi-year capital allowance and the multi-year funding for health and climate and this, I think are significant changes, probably more for the Public Finance Act nerds in the room, but of whom there are some. But it is a really important shift. But the detail of that, our natural resources priorities will be released on budget day. Those questions? Roger.
Minister, has the environment we're in made it a more challenging budget to set this time round, or is it ironically given sort of greater clarity and focus?
I'm yet to find a budget that isn't challenging to put together. It's number 5, and they've all been interesting. But yeah, in all seriousness, the global economic environment is presenting a number of challenges, and obviously the spike in inflation and the cost of living pressures as well. I think for New Zealand, what's important is that the underlying fundamentals of our economy are strong. And that's recognised internationally, so that's not just me saying that. You know, the ratings agencies came in one case gave us a lift to AAA, and in another case reaffirmed us at AAA. IMF, OECD, they've all said similar things. And that underlying strength means that we can make decisions that are just beyond the short term in a way that maybe one or two other countries can't. I've all said also when we put the budget policy statement out that there's a one-off element to this budget. Didn't cover today. We'll in much detail. We'll cover next week and more, and that's the health reforms. So they can, in order to reset the health sector, that requires a one-off boost of spending. Once you look at the costs of running an education system and the costs of doing housing and the basics of public services, that sucks up a fair bit of what's remaining. So people shouldn't be looking at this budget as one where they'll see money being tossed about. It's a budget where we will be making sure that we have plans to be able to grow the economy sustainably, run our public services, and make some pretty important shifts. So, yep, we always have to keep the global environment in mind. Okay.
So the new, this is probably one for the finance skills, the new net debt measuring sort of expands the scope for things that are considered core Crown assets and borrowings. What was the reason previously for excluding those? What's the difference in rationale?
Gentleman sitting behind you can possibly answer that question better than me, but it is actually, my understanding is that there have been concerns about the volatility, particularly of the super fund. And including the super fund in there. And one of the things New Zealanders may need to get used to with the new measure is that there'll be a bit more movement in the net debt numbers. They've been pretty solid through a calendar year or through a budget forecast cycle. You may see a bit more movement because obviously the super fund operates in a more volatile environment. So I understand that that was probably one of the drivers. From our perspective, shifting is important for two main reasons, just to reiterate. The first of those is the international comparability. I mean, every single budget event I've done for 5 years, I've put an IMF chart up and had to explain, well, actually, this is not how we measure it, this is how they measure it. We're much closer now to other countries. Everyone's got little nuances, but the IMF pull it together in such a way that we can see how it looks. So what the number that will come out will be slightly different from that, but very much closer to it. The second reason is that it's a much more accurate picture of our fiscal position. The super fund is the super fund, it's there, it exists, it's part of what New Zealanders have built up over time. On the flip side, the national government opened up the possibility of kāinga ora borrowing off its own balance sheet. We carried that on, but that didn't count against net core crown debt, which frankly speaking was giving a false impression of where the debt level was. And so again, I was coming along to budget briefing saying, well, it's 19%, and then if you add one, it's 20, for kāinga ora it's 20%. So we're actually getting a much better picture with this debt rule, or this debt measure rather, around both assets and liabilities in the economy. So I feel confident about it. Treasury made the recommendation, and I've accepted it.
Minister, could you please comment on the economic and cultural factors that have enabled New Zealand to keep the debt levels quite low over a sustained period, and also is it too conservative? Yeah, I think New Zealanders have understood the importance of saving for a rainy day. And we saw that with COVID. It poured down, and if I can extend the metaphor horribly, the umbrella was able to be put up because we had done that work. And so I think New Zealanders have understood that. Where, if I'm being objective and step back, New Zealanders' private debt, the chart doesn't look quite so rosy, relatively speaking, but from a government debt perspective, we've had that, and I think that's been important. As I alluded to in the speech, and indeed as Treasury have put in their advice to me, I do think point level targets that are low have not been prudent yet. And what the Public Finance Act obliges me as the Minister of Finance to do is to keep a level of prudent debt. Now, obviously, one aspect of being prudent is to keep it relatively low, but I don't think it's prudent to have a debt target that means you don't invest in the infrastructure we need for the future. To me, that's the opposite of being prudent. And so the shift is actually to recognise the very point that you're raising, which is that if we continually go for that target that is very low, we will do future generations a disservice. But it's always a balance, and that's why putting the two fiscal rules together is important. So one part of it is an Obergale surplus, which means from an operating perspective, we have to be careful, and we can't fund that in the future. We can't fund that out of debt. But we can fund those long-term capital investments to a greater extent. And even when we do it, we end up lower than where most countries are. I really hope we can have a mature conversation about public debt in New Zealand. I've been alluding to this for the last year or so, that I think it is important that we do that. It is a balance, but I think you only need to look around the infrastructure in New Zealand to see what the risk is. And if I can pop a little advert in, the Infrastructure Commission's strategy that was released yesterday is a document well worth everyone having a look at. 68 recommendations about what we need to do differently in New Zealand. And it's not all about more money. Some of it is about making sure that we use our assets much better, that we plan and design and procure our infrastructure much more effectively and efficiently. Because actually, we couldn't possibly meet the deficit that we've got in, say, 10 years even, if it was just about adding more money in. We don't have the capacity inside the country to do that anyway. So we've got to do both. We've got to put more money in. This debt target gives us the ability to do that, but equally we've got to be better at how we do it.
Thanks, Minister, for for that update, and really insightful, and I certainly really enjoyed getting the detail around how the fiscal policy and budget rules are set, and like any business, I think, and your last point is actually about how we spend it, you know, and I think that's for any business it's the same, but also for the government, so I look forward to the further detail on that. Hey, so look, that concludes this morning's presentation. I know the Minister's got a number of media commitments, so I just want to say thank you again. Thanks for coming to Rabobank, thanks for allowing us to host, and thank you for the ongoing relationship that we enjoy with everyone that's in the room, including the government. So have a great morning, everyone, and thanks again. Cheers.